Welcome back. President Trump takes center stage tonight when he delivers the State of the Union address at 9 p.m. Eastern. He's expected to highlight his first-year wins of his second term with a focus on the economy and affordability. Several House and Senate Democrats, however, are planning to skip the address altogether and instead attend counter events near the Capitol that the Democrats are planning. All 9 Supreme Court justices are expected to be there and sit in the front row tonight, less than a week after striking down the president's use of emergency for tariffs. Joining me now is Trump Transition Team Senior Advisor Jason Miller. Jason, great to see you. Thank you so much for being here. And I know you were with the president over the weekend as he was perfecting his speech for tonight. What can you tell us about what to expect? What kind of an atmosphere are you expecting?
12 months total transformation. That's the message you're going to hear from the president tonight in his State of the Union address. And I think it's important to remind people that State of the Union speeches aren't about fixing individual potholes. They're about demonstrating vision and laying out the pathway to success. And in the case of President Trump, he's going to talk about how he turned around the country, which was failing under Joe Biden, to now being on a pathway to success. And the key here is what President Trump has really elevated to an art form, and that's using the guests in the gallery to use human stories to talk about how these policies matter for real people, how the working parents have been able to turn things around because of these tax cuts, how people who've been impacted by the horrific crimes of illegal aliens now know that those same horrors won't happen to other people. So President Trump really knows how to connect this back to regular people and what matters in their lives, primarily, as you identified, the economy.
Yeah, great point. In terms of guests in the audience, I'm wondering who will be the guest of the First Lady.
Well, there are a number, and I'm not sure which ones have been teased out yet, so I don't want to give away too much. But I will tell you that the First Lady plays a very important role. And as we've seen teased out, we will have some members of the men's hockey team who will be in attendance. I imagine that will largely steal the show, at least in the first few minutes of the overall State of the Union. There's another important point, Maria, that I want to make, and that's also keep in mind that Democrats have a real tough choice to make tonight, or choices, I should say. And that is, where do they choose to sit? So when the president is talking about things that bring people together, such as voter ID or securing the border or bringing about peace, are Democrats really going to sit on their hands and do nothing while everyone else, including people around the country, are standing and cheering? That's a moment that makes Democrats look small and petty. Keep in mind that with State of the Union addresses, it's really that one point every year where Americans are a captive audience to a president laying out their pathway ahead. And so you have the staging, you have the pomp, you have the circumstance, all this together, and it reminds people there's one person with a microphone in the podium, and that's President Trump.
Well, and what kind of news might we expect tonight? Because I know that the president is going to talk about his victories with regard to the economy, but he will also lay out new policies that he'd like to move forward, right?
Absolutely. And you're going to hear some talk about how some of the tech companies are going to need to bear some of the costs for electricity cost increases. I think a lot of people are rightfully concerned about that, and I think the president has a plan to address those issues. You'll hear the president also talk about health insurance and what we can do to help bring down the costs of that. And then, of course, as I alluded to earlier, what the president is going to do to make sure that we keep the world a safer place. He's already solved, 9 wars, I believe, so far in this first year of his administration. And we're going to talk about how we stay strong as a nation. And also, that's the key. That's the pathway to making sure that we stay peaceful.
Well, it might be a little awkward with the Supreme Court justices sitting right in front of him, right? They're always right there in the front row. And the president has been warning countries against backing away from any recently negotiated trade deals. The president wrote on Truth Social, any country that tries to, quote, play games will face even higher tariffs than the ones previously agreed upon. The Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, of course, will be sitting right behind the president, and he's already warning that Congress is unlikely to find consensus on codifying the president's tariff agenda after the Supreme Court ruling on Friday. What are you expecting there?
Well, two things can be true at the same time here. Yes, of course, people will be looking to see what's going to happen with the tariffs and what the president will say with regard to the Supreme Court or certain justices sitting in the front row. But the overall policy, the overall impact isn't really going to be changed. And that's because one of our superheroes in this equation is our trade representative, Jameson Greer. And Jameson had plans already to go. So the net revenue intake isn't fundamentally going to change. Might be swapping in a couple of different tariffs to replace the IEEPA tariffs, of course, have been struck down. But I think what President Trump in a broader picture is going to do is to remind people that when he came in, the Beltway, it was completely in charge of the entire country. Biden had put the insiders back in charge. What President Trump did was remove that power from them. And unfortunately, some of the justices have decided they want to be the insiders. They want to be part of the status quo. But President Trump is going to reject that status quo and lay out for the American people, here's why these tariffs matter for you, your family. And all you have to do is look around in your cities or in your towns, and you'll see businesses, if not entire industries, have been wiped out by terrible trade policies. He has the plan to fix it.
Yeah, and you're right. Jameson Greer did walk us through several scenarios that they could use way before we got the ruling from the Supreme Court. So he certainly was ready with an agenda for the president once we did see that ruling. Jason, how important is tonight's speech ahead of the midterms? Obviously, Republicans are trying to keep control of the House and Senate with the midterms coming up. We've got multiple seats up for grabs in key districts. And right now, we're talking about the first 2026 midterm primaries happening next week. Texas, a major one. What strategies are the GOP going to use to keep the president's agenda on track and not lose in the midterms?
Right. Well, as you mentioned earlier, it's really the economy, the economy, the economy. Those are going to be the priorities. But also keep in mind, this isn't just some poll-tested equation or some little snappy soundbite. What this is about are what are the themes and the connections to regular people. As you go out and you talk with regular people, whether it's at your job or at home or at the game on the weekend, what is it that they're thinking about the economy and how it matters to them? And so there's a disconnect there, I think, between many on Wall Street and actual Main Street, where regular people are impacted. But also keep in mind there'll be some patriotic themes that we're going to hear tonight. We talk about America 250 as we come up on our 250th anniversary. And what President Trump is going to use, and again, I want to go back to this point, is use those real human success stories about how his policies have either saved lives or made lives much more prosperous and better. That's the connectivity that then I think these folks running for Congress and Senate can use in their own campaigns.
All right. Great stuff all around. Jason, thank you for that very informative preview. We so appreciate it. Jason Miller joining us.